As you close your eyes tonight, let your mind wander to the grandest castle in medieval France, where golden tapestries line the walls and servants bow before their king. Tonight's story begins with King Louis IX, later called St. Louis, sitting on his throne in 1250, desperately trying not to scratch the hundreds of flea bites covering his royal body, blood seeping through his silk robes as he holds court with foreign ambassadors. Picture this scene: the most powerful monarch in Europe, draped in ermine and gold, his crown catching candlelight as he shifts uncomfortably on his throne, fighting an impossible battle against tiny invaders that no amount of royal authority can command. The Venetian ambassador watches in horror as red welts appear on the king's neck, while the English envoy pretends not to notice when Louis discreetly rakes his fingernails across his forearm, leaving fresh scratches on skin already raw from constant irritation. Behind them, courtiers exchange nervous glances as their own bodies betray them with involuntary twitching and scratching, creating a bizarre symphony of rustling silk and suppressed groans throughout the magnificent hall. This isn't some peasant suffering in a hovel. This is the man who leads the Seventh Crusade, who commands armies across Europe, yet he cannot conquer the microscopic enemies living in his own bedchamber. The throne itself, carved from the finest oak and cushioned with velvet that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, harbors thousands of these bloodthirsty parasites in every fold and crevice. Louis knows this, his servants know this, yet the daily ritual continues because medieval protocol demands that kings must hold court, regardless of whether they're being devoured alive by creatures invisible to the naked eye. The irony would be hilarious if it weren't so universally miserable. Every night, Louis climbs into his magnificent four-poster bed, adorned with the finest silks imported from Byzantium and furs from the northern wilderness, only to spend hours writhing in agony as hundreds of fleas emerge from the straw mattresses like tiny vampires seeking royal blood. His physicians, the most learned men in France, offer brilliant solutions like bloodletting to balance the humors, and burning incense to purify the air, completely missing the obvious connection between the castle's appalling hygiene practices and the relentless plague of parasites that torment everyone from scullery maids to archbishops. These same doctors, who can recite Greek medical texts from memory and debate the finer points of Galenic theory for hours, stand helplessly as their king tears at his skin until it bleeds, leaving permanent scars that tell the story of medieval powerlessness against nature's smallest army. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating: Louis isn't unique or particularly unlucky. Across medieval Europe, from the stone palaces of England to the mountain fortresses of the Holy Roman Empire, everyone is scratching, bleeding, and slowly losing their sanity from creatures smaller than a grain of rice. The same kings who sign treaties that reshape continents spend their nights clawing at their skin until they bleed, their royal dignity dissolving into desperate, animalistic relief-seeking that would shock modern observers. Imagine trying to negotiate a crucial peace treaty with neighboring kingdoms while your scalp feels like it's crawling with fire ants, or attempting to deliver a stirring speech to rally troops for battle when all you can think about is the burning, itching sensation spreading across your back like some medieval form of torture. This is medieval life stripped of all romantic nonsense and fairy tale glamour. No amount of shining armor can protect you from fleas, no treasure room filled with gold can buy you a single peaceful night's sleep, and no royal decree backed by the authority of God and crown can stop these tiny tyrants from turning the most powerful people on earth into scratching, miserable, sleep-deprived wrecks. What we're about to explore isn't just a story about questionable hygiene practices or the challenges of medieval castle life. It's an epic tale of human helplessness against nature's smallest but most persistent warriors, where crowns and titles and noble bloodlines mean absolutely nothing when you're being eaten alive in your own bed by enemies you can barely see. Now, to understand why the most powerful people in medieval Europe were losing their minds to tiny parasites, we need to travel back to this bizarre world of 1250, where kings could mobilize armies of 50,000 men but had absolutely no clue that washing their bodies might solve their pest problem. This was the height of medieval power, Gothic cathedrals reaching toward heaven, universities sprouting across Europe, and monarchs wielding absolute authority over millions of subjects. Yet these same brilliant civilizations that invented complex legal systems and built architectural marvels that still inspire awe today somehow convinced themselves that bathing was not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous to human health. The medical establishment, led by scholars who had translated Greek and Arabic texts and could debate the finer points of astronomy, unanimously agreed that hot water opened the pores and allowed evil vapors to penetrate the body, causing everything from madness to sudden death. According to the dominant medical theory of the time, the human body contained 4 essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and maintaining perfect balance between these substances was the key to health and longevity. Bathing, they believed, disrupted this delicate equilibrium by heating the blood and creating dangerous imbalances that could prove fatal. Physicians across Europe wrote lengthy treatises explaining how water weakened the body's natural defenses and made people vulnerable to diseases that prowled the night air like invisible demons. The Church reinforced these beliefs by declaring that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness demonstrated sinful vanity and pride, deadly sins that could condemn souls to eternal damnation. Saint Benedict himself had warned against the spiritual dangers of frequent washing, and medieval Christians took these warnings seriously. Monks proudly boasted about never having touched water for decades, wearing their accumulated grime like badges of holy devotion. Some saints were canonized partly because they had maintained such impressive levels of filthiness throughout their lives, proving their complete rejection of worldly pleasures and material concerns. Noble ladies at court would go months without changing their undergarments, considering clean clothes a sign of moral weakness and spiritual corruption. The result was a society where the smell of unwashed human bodies was so universal that people developed sophisticated methods of masking odors rather than eliminating their source. Expensive perfumes, imported spices, and fragrant herbs became essential accessories for anyone who could afford them, creating a bizarre economy where the solution to stench was more stench, just more expensive and socially acceptable stench. Castles were designed with this philosophy in mind. Thick stone walls kept out enemies and cold winds, but also trapped every odor inside like a medieval greenhouse of human funk. Fresh air was considered dangerous, so windows remained small and frequently closed, creating perfect breeding conditions for every parasite known to science. The floors were covered with rushes and straw that absorbed years of accumulated bodily fluids, food scraps, and animal waste, creating a carpet of organic matter that hosted entire ecosystems of insects, rodents, and microscopic organisms. Castle inhabitants would simply add fresh straw on top of the old layers, creating what amounted to a giant compost pile that people walked on daily. In this environment, fleas weren't just common, they were practically inevitable. These creatures thrived in the warm, humid, organic-rich environment that medieval people had accidentally created in their quest to avoid the dangers of cleanliness. The irony was spectacular. In their desperate attempt to protect their health by avoiding water, medieval Europeans had created living conditions that guaranteed they would be tortured by parasites every single day of their lives. Kings who commanded the most advanced military technology of their age, who understood complex principles of engineering and architecture, remained completely baffled by the connection between their unwashed bedding and their nightly torment. This wasn't ignorance born from lack of intelligence. These were sophisticated people living in a sophisticated society that had simply developed completely wrong ideas about how the human body worked and what it needed to stay healthy. But the medieval relationship with cleanliness went far beyond simple medical ignorance. It became a twisted cultural phenomenon where being dirty was actually a status symbol and washing yourself marked you as spiritually weak or possibly demonic. Throughout medieval Europe, nobles competed in bizarre contests of filthiness, bragging about how many years they had gone without changing their undergarments or touching water to their skin. Queen Isabella of Castile famously boasted that she had only bathed twice in her entire life, once when she was born and once before her wedding day, and this declaration wasn't met with disgust but with admiration from her courtiers who saw her as a paragon of Christian virtue. The most prestigious members of society wore their accumulated grime like expensive jewelry, displaying layers of dirt and grease as proof of their spiritual dedication and moral superiority. Medieval fashion actually accommodated this philosophy by designing clothes that could hide stains and absorb odors for months without requiring cleaning. Rich fabrics like velvet and heavy wool became popular partly because they could maintain their appearance even when thoroughly contaminated with bodily fluids, food stains, and whatever other substances medieval people encountered in their daily lives. Clothing was treated as permanent fixtures rather than washable items. Wealthy individuals would own multiple sets of the same outfit and simply rotate between them when one became too offensive even by medieval standards. The concept of underwear existed, but changing it regularly was considered a suspicious habit that suggested unhealthy preoccupation with physical comfort. Some nobles would sew themselves into their winter garments at the beginning of cold seasons and not emerge until spring, creating what amounted to wearable prison cells that trapped months of human waste against their skin. This practice was so common that medieval calendars actually marked special days when people were expected to change clothes, usually coinciding with major religious holidays when spiritual purification required some token gesture toward physical cleanliness. The church developed elaborate rituals around these rare cleaning events, blessing new clothes and performing ceremonies to protect wearers from the spiritual dangers of clean fabric touching clean skin. Monks invented ingenious methods for staying dirty while maintaining the appearance of piety. They would rub ash and dirt into their robes to achieve the perfect shade of holy filthiness, and some monasteries held competitions to see which brother could accumulate the most impressive collection of stains and odors. Medieval people even developed a sophisticated vocabulary for describing different types of beneficial dirt. There was holy grime acquired through prayer and fasting, noble filth that came from avoiding vanity and worldly pleasures, and warrior dirt earned through battle and hardship. Each category carried different social implications and required specific maintenance techniques to preserve its spiritual potency. Wealthy families employed servants whose primary job was to assess and maintain their master's dirt levels, ensuring that the accumulation appeared natural rather than artificially enhanced. These grime consultants became highly valued specialists who could distinguish between spiritually beneficial filth and the kind of random dirtiness that might suggest laziness rather than holiness. The result was a society where taking a bath was literally considered a sin against God, where clean teeth were seen as evidence of moral corruption, and where the smell of unwashed human bodies became so normalized that people developed romantic poetry celebrating the distinctive aromas of their beloved's unwashed hair and clothes. Medieval love songs included verses praising the beloved's authentic natural perfume and honest earthly essence, which were poetic ways of saying your girlfriend hadn't bathed in 6 months and you found that attractive. This cultural obsession with avoiding cleanliness created the perfect environment for every parasite known to medieval science, turning human bodies into mobile restaurants for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and creatures that modern people would find in horror movies rather than their bedrooms. The crisis that would define medieval castle life began on a humid August night in 1251 at the Château de Vincennes, when King Louis IX experienced what court chroniclers would later describe as the Night of Royal Awakening, though they weren't referring to any spiritual enlightenment. The king had just returned from a diplomatic mission to England, exhausted from weeks of travel and eager to sleep in his own magnificent bedchamber with its imported Byzantine silks and hand-carved wooden frame that had cost the equivalent of a small army's annual wages. What Louis didn't know was that during his absence, the castle's servants had refreshed his sleeping quarters by adding several cartloads of fresh straw beneath his mattress, straw that had been stored in the stables alongside grain that was already thoroughly colonized by the largest flea population in northern France. As the king settled into what he expected to be a peaceful night's rest after weeks of uncomfortable travel, thousands of hungry fleas began emerging from their new home like tiny vampires sensing fresh royal blood. The attack began slowly, a few irritating bites that Louis initially dismissed as minor annoyances, the kind of thing that happened to everyone in medieval times. But within an hour, the situation escalated into something approaching medieval biological warfare as wave after wave of fleas discovered that the King of France was essentially a mobile feast who had been delivered directly to their doorstep. By midnight, Louis was scratching so violently that he tore holes in his silk nightshirt, leaving bloody fingerprints on fabric worth more than most peasants saw in their lifetimes. The king's personal servants, sleeping in adjacent chambers, were awakened by sounds they initially mistook for an assassination attempt, groaning, thrashing, and what sounded like furniture being violently moved around the royal bedroom. When they cautiously entered with candles to investigate, they discovered their monarch rolling on the floor in his undergarments, clawing at his skin like a madman while thousands of tiny black specks jumped and crawled across every surface in the room. The scene was so shocking that one servant fainted and another began praying for the king's soul, convinced that demons had possessed their ruler during the night. Louis himself was beyond rational thought, consumed by an itching sensation so intense that he later described it as feeling like his entire body had been set on fire from the inside. His royal physician, Master Guillaume, was summoned immediately and arrived to find the most powerful man in Europe reduced to a writhing, bleeding mess who couldn't stop scratching long enough to form coherent sentences. The doctor's first diagnosis was demonic possession, followed quickly by theories involving corrupted blood, excessive heat in the liver, and possible poisoning by political enemies who had somehow introduced evil spirits into the royal bedchamber. What made this incident particularly catastrophic was its timing. The next morning, Louis was scheduled to receive a delegation from the Holy Roman Emperor to discuss a crucial alliance that could reshape the balance of power in Europe. Instead of appearing as the dignified, authoritative monarch that diplomacy required, the king looked like he had survived a week-long battle against invisible enemies, covered in scratches, welts, and dried blood that no amount of royal cosmetics could disguise. The imperial ambassadors, accustomed to the refined protocols of their own court, were visibly horrified when Louis appeared for the morning audience scratching his arms and neck compulsively while trying to conduct negotiations that would affect millions of lives. This wasn't just a personal health crisis, it was a diplomatic disaster that threatened France's international standing and revealed the complete helplessness of medieval medicine against problems that any modern 5-year-old could solve with soap and hot water. The Château de Vincennes incident became the catalyst that forced medieval nobility to confront an uncomfortable truth. All their wealth, power, and divine authority meant absolutely nothing when faced with creatures so small they were barely visible, yet so numerous and persistent that they could reduce kings to desperate, scratching animals who couldn't maintain basic human dignity in front of foreign dignitaries. The morning after the Great Flea invasion of Vincennes revealed something perhaps more disturbing than the infestation itself: the spectacular lengths to which medieval court society would go to pretend that nothing unusual was happening, even when their king was obviously being eaten alive by parasites in front of their eyes. As Louis IX entered the Great Hall for his crucial diplomatic meeting, his body covered in angry red welts and scratch marks that were clearly visible despite his attempt to cover them with heavy robes, every single person in the room made a collective decision to act as if they were witnessing perfectly normal royal behavior. The French courtiers had perfected the art of diplomatic blindness over decades of navigating court politics, but this morning tested their abilities beyond anything they had previously encountered. Count Robert d'Artois, Louis's own brother, maintained such intense eye contact with the king's face that he developed a visible nervous tic rather than allow his gaze to drift toward the bloody scratches covering his sibling's neck and hands. The Archbishop of Reims, a man known for his moral courage in confronting royal misconduct, suddenly became fascinated by the intricate stonework of the ceiling whenever the king paused mid-sentence to rake his fingernails across his forearms with audible scratching sounds that echoed throughout the stone hall. Meanwhile, the imperial ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire were experiencing their own cultural crisis as they tried to process what they were witnessing without violating the elaborate protocols that governed international diplomacy. Ambassador Heinrich von Nuremberg had been briefed extensively on French customs and etiquette, but nobody had prepared him for a scenario where he would need to negotiate a military alliance while the French king compulsively scratched himself like a peasant with scabies. His training told him that acknowledging the king's obvious distress would be a grave insult that could derail the entire diplomatic mission, yet ignoring it felt like participating in some bizarre form of collective madness that called into question his own sanity. The situation became increasingly surreal as the morning progressed and Louis's scratching grew more desperate and obvious, yet the elaborate dance of pretense continued without missing a beat. When the king excused himself mid-sentence to scratch his back against his throne like a bear rubbing against a tree, his chancellor immediately began discussing grain exports with such animated enthusiasm that he attracted everyone's attention away from their monarch's undignified behavior. Court ladies fanned themselves vigorously and commented loudly on the exceptional warmth of the morning, creating enough noise and visual distraction to mask the sound of royal fingernails tearing at royal flesh. The servants had been given explicit instructions to behave as if nothing unusual was occurring, but several broke under the psychological pressure of maintaining this fiction. One page began giggling uncontrollably during a solemn moment of treaty discussion and had to be physically removed from the hall, while a serving girl dropped an entire tray of wine goblets when she made the mistake of looking directly at the king's legs, where blood spots were beginning to seep through his silk stockings. Perhaps most telling was the reaction of visiting clergy, who immediately began searching their theological knowledge for explanations that would allow them to maintain their worldview while processing the evidence of their senses. Bishop Etienne de Bourges quietly suggested to his companions that they might be witnessing a holy mortification of the flesh, where God was testing the king's spiritual strength through physical tribulation, a theory that allowed them to frame Louis's obvious agony as evidence of divine favor rather than parasitic infestation. The diplomatic corps adopted different survival strategies. Some focused so intently on their written notes that they appeared to be documenting every word spoken, while others developed sudden and intense interest in the tapestries, window decorations and architectural details that allowed them to avoid making eye contact with anyone while still appearing properly attentive to the proceedings. By afternoon, the entire court had settled into a rhythm of elaborate mutual pretense that resembled nothing so much as a theatrical performance where everyone knew their lines but nobody wanted to acknowledge what play they were actually performing. The most disturbing aspect of this collective denial wasn't just the immediate discomfort it created, but the precedent it established from that day forward. Medieval courts across Europe would develop increasingly sophisticated methods for ignoring obvious evidence that their systems of power and authority were failing in the most basic and humiliating ways. Within days of the Vincennes incident, every medical authority in medieval France mobilized to solve what they grandly termed the royal parasitic crisis, bringing to bear the full weight of 13th-century scientific knowledge in an effort that would prove both heroically ambitious and spectacularly useless. Master Guillaume, Louis IX's personal physician and graduate of the prestigious medical school at Montpellier, arrived at court with a leather satchel full of instruments, manuscripts, and supreme confidence in his ability to diagnose and treat any condition that dared afflict royal flesh. After conducting what he considered a thorough examination, which involved studying the king's urine color, checking the alignment of celestial bodies, and taking detailed notes on the patient's dreams, Guillaume announced his professional verdict with the authority of a man who had spent 20 years memorizing ancient Greek medical texts that were already wrong when they were written. The fleas, he declared, were merely symptoms of a much deeper problem. The king's blood had become overheated due to excessive consumption of warm foods during the recent diplomatic journey, creating an internal furnace that was literally cooking His Majesty from within and attracting parasites who were drawn to this unnatural heat like moths to flame. The solution, according to Guillaume's impeccable medical logic, was immediate bloodletting to cool the royal circulation, followed by a strict diet of cold, moist foods designed to restore proper humoral balance and make the king's body less appetizing to fleas who apparently had sophisticated preferences about their victims' internal temperature. When this treatment produced no improvement after several weeks, during which Louis grew pale and weak from blood loss while the flea population continued to thrive, Guillaume consulted with his colleagues and developed an even more elaborate theory involving corrupted air, malignant planetary influences, and possible contamination by evil vapors that had somehow penetrated the castle's defenses. The medical establishment's response escalated quickly from individual consultation to full academic conference, as physicians from across Europe traveled to Vincennes to examine this fascinating case and contribute their own theories to what became a scholarly debate of epic proportions. Dr. Andreas of Salerno proposed that the fleas were generated spontaneously by the king's corrupted humors, essentially arguing that Louis was unconsciously creating his own tormentors through internal biological processes that violated natural law. Professor Jean of Paris countered with the theory that foreign enemies had introduced cursed fleas through sorcery, possibly working in conjunction with Muslim alchemists who had developed supernatural methods for weaponizing insects. The University of Bologna sent their most distinguished expert on parasitic diseases, who spent 3 weeks studying the situation before concluding that the entire problem stemmed from the king's excessive virtue, which had created a spiritual imbalance that manifested physically as an attraction to creatures representing earthly corruption. Meanwhile, the church hierarchy was developing its own competing explanation that managed to be both theologically sophisticated and practically worthless. Archbishop Boniface of Canterbury arrived at court with a team of theologians who had concluded that the flea infestation was actually a divine test similar to the plagues visited upon Egypt, designed to strengthen the king's faith and demonstrate God's power over earthly rulers who might become too proud of their temporal authority. This interpretation conveniently transformed Louis's nightly torment from a medical crisis into a spiritual opportunity, allowing church officials to recommend prayer, fasting, and generous donations to religious institutions as the appropriate treatment for parasitic infection. The most creative theological explanation came from Brother Thomas of Aquino, who argued that fleas represented the temporary nature of worldly pleasure and comfort, serving as constant reminders that even kings must suffer in preparation for eternal salvation. His proposed solution involved embracing the fleas as divine messengers rather than trying to eliminate them, essentially recommending that Louis learn to appreciate being eaten alive as a form of holy communion with God's smaller creatures. The competition between medical and religious authorities reached absurd heights when both groups began claiming exclusive jurisdiction over the king's condition, leading to heated debates about whether flea bites fell under the category of physical ailment or spiritual trial, and whether the appropriate treatment required university-trained physicians or ordained clergy with access to holy relics and blessed oils. As medical theories and theological explanations proved utterly useless against the relentless flea armies, medieval ingenuity turned toward increasingly bizarre practical solutions that demonstrated both human creativity and complete ignorance of basic biology. The first major innovation came from Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England, who had heard about the French flea crisis through diplomatic channels and decided that the solution lay in military-style strategic thinking applied to pest control. Eleanor commissioned the construction of what she called flea fortifications, essentially elaborate wooden barriers around beds that were designed to function like castle walls, keeping out tiny invaders through superior engineering and careful positioning. These contraptions, built by the same craftsmen who created siege engines, featured multiple layers of defense including moats filled with scented oils, drawbridges that could be raised at night, and tiny battlements where servants could theoretically stand guard against approaching flea armies. The irony of England's royal engineers applying castle siege principles to bedroom warfare was lost on everyone involved. who took the project with deadly seriousness and spent months perfecting designs that had no chance of working against creatures that could jump 20 times their own height. Meanwhile, the papal court in Rome was developing its own approach based on the revolutionary theory that fleas were actually attracted to sin and moral corruption, meaning the solution lay in spiritual purification rather than physical intervention. Pope Innocent IV authorized the creation of special blessing oils that combined holy water with expensive aromatics like frankincense, myrrh, and imported spices, creating potions that cost more than most nobles' annual income and had absolutely no effect on parasites but made everything smell like a religious ceremony. Churches across Europe began offering special flea-banishing services where priests would bless beds, clothes, and even individual people with elaborate ceremonies designed to make human bodies spiritually unappealing to insects who apparently had strong religious preferences. The competition aspect of medieval flea warfare emerged when various courts began comparing their infestations as measures of either divine disfavor or, paradoxically, spiritual importance, depending on which theological interpretation was currently fashionable. The court of Frederick II in Sicily proudly claimed to host the largest and most vigorous flea population in the Holy Roman Empire, arguing that this demonstrated God's special attention to their kingdom and the emperor's significance in divine plans for Europe. Other nobles began measuring their religious devotion by flea density, with some monasteries keeping detailed records of parasite populations as evidence of their spiritual achievements and complete rejection of worldly comfort. Perhaps the most spectacular failure belonged to the French royal engineers, who designed and built enormous fumigation chambers based on siege warfare principles, essentially creating medieval gas chambers where furniture, clothing, and even people could be enclosed and subjected to various combinations of smoke, steam, and aromatic vapors that were supposed to eliminate fleas through superior chemistry. These contraptions, powered by complex systems of bellows and heating apparatus, consumed vast amounts of wood and exotic materials while producing clouds of smoke so dense that several operators nearly suffocated during testing phases, yet had no measurable effect on flea populations who seemed to treat the fumigation process as a pleasant sauna experience. The arms race intensified when Italian nobles began importing what they claimed were sacred cats from Egypt, believing that felines blessed by proximity to ancient temples would possess supernatural flea-hunting abilities superior to ordinary European cats. These exotic imports, which cost fortunes in transportation and care, proved no more effective than local cats but became status symbols that demonstrated both wealth and commitment to innovative pest control methods. Castle staff developed elaborate protocols for caring for these blessed hunters, including special diets, designated sleeping areas, and even religious ceremonies designed to maintain their holy powers, creating an entire economy around cat worship disguised as practical pest management. The medieval obsession with finding technological solutions reached its peak with the invention of mechanical flea traps that resembled miniature torture devices, featuring springs, levers, and bait systems so complex that they required dedicated operators and regular maintenance, yet caught fewer fleas than a servant with quick reflexes and good eyesight. These devices became conversation pieces that demonstrated their owners' sophisticated understanding of engineering principles while providing no actual relief from the creatures that continued to thrive regardless of human ingenuity, wealth, or determination. By 1252, what had begun as a localized irritation in French castles had snowballed into a continental diplomatic crisis that was reshaping European politics in ways that would have been impossible to predict and embarrassing to document in official chronicles. The first major casualty was the proposed marriage alliance between Prince Edward of England and Princess Marguerite of France, a union that would have united two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms and potentially prevented decades of future warfare. The engagement collapsed not because of political disagreements or religious conflicts, but because Prince Edward's diplomatic visit to the French court coincided with what historians would later call the Great Infestation of 1252, when flea populations at multiple French castles reached levels so extreme that foreign dignitaries began fleeing in the middle of negotiations. Edward himself lasted exactly 3 days at Vincennes before announcing that he would rather face Muslim armies in the Holy Land than spend another night being devoured by creatures that made sleep impossible and rational thought nearly unattainable. His dramatic departure, which involved leaving in the middle of the night without formal farewell ceremonies, created a diplomatic incident that required months of careful negotiation to resolve and left both courts embarrassed about circumstances they couldn't publicly acknowledge. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual marriage negotiations, as the European diplomatic calendar became increasingly chaotic due to what ambassadors privately called the scratching problem. Crucial treaty discussions were repeatedly postponed when key participants arrived at infested castles and immediately developed conditions that made them unable to concentrate on complex legal language or maintain the dignified bearing that international negotiations required. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II himself cancelled a planned summit with multiple European rulers after receiving detailed reports from his advanced scouts about flea conditions at the proposed meeting location, leading to rumors that he was avoiding his peers due to cowardice or illness rather than simple unwillingness to be eaten alive by parasites. Medieval record-keeping, which typically documented every aspect of royal life in exhaustive detail, began developing curious gaps and euphemisms when describing these incidents, with official chroniclers referring vaguely to atmospheric disturbances and seasonal challenges that disrupted important political events. The most significant consequence emerged when King Henry III of England, driven to desperation by his own castle's flea problem, made what historians now recognize as one of the most expensive pest control decisions in medieval history. After weeks of sleepless nights that left him irritable and unable to focus on governing, Henry authorized the complete reconstruction of Westminster Palace using a revolutionary new design that prioritized flea prevention over traditional architectural principles. This massive construction project, which consumed approximately 30% of England's annual royal revenue, featured raised floors, specialized ventilation systems, and furnishings designed to minimize hiding places for parasites, essentially creating the medieval equivalent of a sterile environment. The project's enormous cost forced Henry to increase taxes across England, leading to noble rebellion, popular unrest, and eventually the signing of the Provisions of Oxford in 1258, which significantly limited royal power and established new principles of parliamentary governance that would influence English politics for centuries. The historical irony is spectacular. One of England's most important constitutional developments was directly triggered by a king's desperate attempt to get a good night's sleep without being attacked by fleas. Similar economic pressures affected courts across Europe as rulers bankrupted their treasuries, pursuing increasingly expensive and ineffective solutions to parasite problems that could have been solved with soap and hot water if medieval culture hadn't convinced everyone that cleanliness was spiritually dangerous. The flea crisis also disrupted military campaigns in unexpected ways, as knights and soldiers who were already exhausted from constant sleep deprivation proved less effective in battle and more susceptible to diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions that medieval armies considered normal. Several crucial battles during this period may have been influenced by the simple fact that one army's leadership had gotten better sleep than their opponents, though official military histories would never acknowledge such an undignified factor in determining the fate of kingdoms and the balance of European power. Just when medieval Europe thought the flea situation couldn't become more bizarre, Eleanor of Provence decided to implement what she called the Great Purge of 1252, a solution so radical and expensive that it would make Henry III's palace reconstruction project look like modest home improvement. Eleanor had become obsessed with the idea that the flea problem required military-level strategic thinking and decisive action rather than the half-measures and theoretical debates that had characterized previous attempts at pest control. Her plan was breathtakingly simple in concept and catastrophically complex in execution. She would simultaneously eliminate every single piece of fabric, straw, and organic material from Windsor Castle, essentially stripping one of England's most important royal residences down to bare stone and then rebuilding the interior environment from scratch using materials that had never been exposed to flea contamination. The logistical challenges were staggering. Eleanor's plan required the coordinated removal and destruction of thousands of tapestries, carpets, mattresses, pillows, curtains, and furniture pieces that represented centuries of accumulated wealth and artistic achievement, including irreplaceable works that had been gifts from foreign rulers and heirloom pieces that connected the English royal family to their Norman ancestors. The Queen organized this massive undertaking like a military campaign, with detailed schedules, assigned responsibilities, and contingency plans for every possible complication that might arise during the systematic dismantling of royal luxury. On the appointed day, Windsor Castle became the scene of what observers described as controlled chaos, as hundreds of servants, craftsmen, and laborers worked in carefully coordinated teams to strip every room of its contents and transport everything to enormous bonfires that had been constructed in the castle courtyards. The sight of priceless tapestries, silk bed hangings, and hand-carved furniture being fed into flames created such dramatic visual spectacle that crowds of local peasants gathered to watch what they interpreted as either royal madness or some new form of religious ceremony. Eleanor herself supervised the destruction with the intensity of a general directing a siege, checking items off detailed lists and ensuring that nothing escaped the purification process that she believed would finally break the cycle of flea infestation that had tormented English royalty for months. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. The value of destroyed materials exceeded the annual tax revenue from several English counties, forcing the crown to borrow heavily from Italian bankers who charged interest rates that would burden the royal finances for decades. But Eleanor's commitment to her vision remained absolute even as the costs mounted and critics began questioning her sanity along with her financial judgment. The replacement phase of the project proved even more expensive than the destruction, as Eleanor insisted on importing new materials from distant regions that she believed were naturally flea-resistant, including special woods from Scandinavia, fabrics from Constantinople, and exotic fibers from North Africa that required months of travel time and elaborate preservation methods. She hired specialists from across Europe to advise on anti-flea construction techniques, paying enormous consulting fees to experts whose credentials consisted mainly of confident assertions about their understanding of parasite behavior and medieval architectural principles. The most spectacular aspect of Eleanor's purge was her decision to have every new piece of furniture, fabric, and decorative item blessed by teams of priests before installation, creating elaborate religious ceremonies around mattress placement and curtain hanging that transformed interior decoration into sacred ritual. These blessing ceremonies, which required expensive offerings and donations to multiple religious institutions, added another layer of cost to a project that was already consuming resources at an unprecedented rate. The final results were mixed at best. Windsor Castle's newly purified interior did show reduced flea activity for several weeks, leading Eleanor to declare victory and commission official chroniclers to document her triumph over the forces of parasitic evil. However, the flea population began recovering within months as new infestations arrived through the same channels that had originally introduced the problem, essentially proving that Eleanor had spent a fortune addressing symptoms while ignoring root causes. The Great Purge became a cautionary tale about the dangers of applying excessive resources to problems that required understanding rather than wealth, though this lesson would be completely lost on future generations of medieval rulers who continued to believe that royal authority and unlimited spending could solve any challenge, no matter how deeply rooted in ignorance and cultural blindness. As flea populations continued to thrive despite increasingly expensive and elaborate countermeasures, medieval castle societies began turning on themselves in ways that revealed the ugly social dynamics lurking beneath the polished surface of courtly civilization. The first victims of this internal warfare were the servants, who found themselves blamed for every aspect of the flea crisis despite having no control over the fundamental hygiene policies that created and perpetuated the problem. At Vincennes, King Louis IX Chamberlain, a man named Philippe who had served the royal household faithfully for 15 years, was publicly flogged and demoted after the king discovered fresh flea bites on his legs following what was supposed to be a thoroughly cleaned bedchamber. Philippe's punishment was particularly cruel because everyone involved knew that no amount of individual effort could eliminate fleas from an environment where basic sanitation practices were considered sinful and dangerous, yet the need to blame someone for the ongoing torment overrode any consideration of logic or fairness. The paranoia spread through castle hierarchies like a contagious disease, with each level of authority desperately seeking someone lower in the social order to hold responsible for conditions that were fundamentally systemic rather than individual failures. Head housekeepers found themselves conducting nighttime inspections of servant quarters, searching for evidence of inadequate flea prevention efforts and punishing staff members who couldn't produce proof of sufficient vigilance against creatures that were literally invisible to medieval detection methods. Some servants were executed on charges of deliberate sabotage when flea populations in their assigned areas exceeded arbitrary thresholds established by increasingly irrational nobles who were losing their minds from sleep deprivation and constant physical irritation. The competition for cleaner accommodations within infested castles created vicious political battles that destroyed friendships, broke up alliances, and turned previously civilized courtiers into scheming enemies willing to use any available leverage to secure better sleeping arrangements. Duke Robert of Normandy challenged Count William of Poitou to a formal duel after discovering that William had secretly bribed servants to treat his chambers with expensive imported oils while allowing Robert's rooms to remain untreated, essentially turning pest control into a matter of honor that required bloodshed to resolve. These conflicts escalated when nobles began hiring private investigators to spy on their peers and document evidence of special flea prevention measures that violated the informal agreements about shared suffering that had previously maintained castle social order. Lady Isabel de Montfort bankrupted herself paying for secret intelligence about which chambers in various castles had the lowest parasite densities, then used this information to manipulate room assignments during diplomatic visits and social events, creating a shadowy economy of accommodation espionage that consumed enormous resources while producing minimal actual relief. The religious community within castles developed their own internal schisms as different clerical factions proposed competing theological explanations for the ongoing crisis and fought bitter doctrinal battles over appropriate spiritual responses to physical torment. Brother Thomas insisted that accepting flea bites without complaint demonstrated proper Christian submission to divine will, while Father Michel argued that actively fighting parasites showed proper stewardship of the body as God's temple, leading to heated debates that sometimes escalated into physical confrontations between monks who were already irritable from months of interrupted sleep and constant itching. These theological disputes became proxies for deeper political conflicts within religious hierarchies, with ambitious church officials using flea-related controversies as opportunities to advance their careers by demonstrating superior spiritual insight or more orthodox positions on questions that had never previously existed in Christian doctrine. The most destructive internal conflict emerged when castle inhabitants began forming secret societies dedicated to different approaches to the flea problem, essentially creating underground resistance movements within the same buildings where they lived and worked together. These clandestine organizations, with names like the Order of the Clean Chamber and the Brotherhood of Sacred Suffering, developed elaborate initiation rituals, secret codes, and competing philosophies about proper responses to parasitic invasion that transformed minor disagreements about pest control into ideological warfare that threatened the basic functioning of medieval court society and demonstrated how quickly civilized people could descend into tribal conflict when subjected to persistent physical torment and systematic sleep deprivation. In the autumn of 1253, as previous solutions had failed spectacularly and the flea crisis threatened to destabilize European civilization, Pope Innocent IV announced what he proclaimed would be the definitive spiritual solution to the parasitic plague that was tormenting Christendom: the Great Pilgrimage of Purification, a massive religious undertaking that would mobilize thousands of believers in a coordinated effort to pray the fleas out of existence through sheer force of divine intervention. The Pope's plan, developed after months of theological consultation with the Church's most learned scholars, was based on the revolutionary theory that fleas represented a collective punishment for the sins of medieval society, meaning the solution lay not in individual pest control measures but in mass spiritual cleansing that would convince God to recall his tiny agents of divine justice. The logistics of organizing a continental pilgrimage dedicated specifically to flea elimination required unprecedented coordination between church authorities across Europe, as bishops were instructed to recruit participants who would travel to Rome carrying specially prepared relics, blessed oils, and personal testimonies about their suffering at the hands of parasitic tormentors. The theological framework supporting this massive undertaking became increasingly elaborate as church scholars developed detailed explanations for how collective prayer and ritual purification could influence insect behavior through divine intervention that operated according to spiritual laws that transcended natural philosophy. Cardinal Alessandro di Monferrato, the Pope's chief theological advisor, wrote extensive treatises explaining how fleas served as instruments of divine correction similar to the plagues of Egypt, arguing that proper religious response could convince God to redirect these creatures toward more deserving targets like heretics, Muslims, and other enemies of Christendom who clearly deserved to be eaten alive by parasites. The pilgrimage attracted an estimated 15,000 participants from across Europe, including nobles who traveled in elaborate processions with wagons full of flea-infested bedding that they planned to have blessed and purified through exposure to holy relics and papal benediction. The sight of medieval Europe's most distinguished citizens traveling hundreds of miles while carrying their mattresses, pillows, and clothing like precious cargo created spectacles that amazed and confused local populations who had never witnessed religious devotion focused on household furnishings. Rome itself was transformed into what resembled a giant outdoor laundry as pilgrims spread their possessions across every available surface near churches and holy sites, creating a landscape of medieval textiles that stretched for miles and required special papal guards to prevent theft and maintain order among crowds of desperate believers. The climactic ceremony took place in St. Peter's Square, where Pope Innocent IV conducted an elaborate mass blessing that lasted for 6 hours and involved chanting specific prayers that had been composed by teams of theologians working in collaboration with scholars who claimed expertise in insect behavior and divine communication. The ritual included the burning of expensive incense combinations designed to create spiritual atmospheres that would be offensive to fleas while remaining pleasing to God, essentially attempting to negotiate a supernatural pest control contract through aromatic diplomacy. Participants were required to confess their sins in special categories that church authorities had identified as particularly attractive to flea infestation, including vanity, pride, gluttony, and insufficient charity toward the poor, creating a theological system that blamed flea victims for their own suffering while promising relief through proper spiritual correction. The most spectacular aspect of the ceremony involved the simultaneous blessing of thousands of individual items as Pope Innocent walked among the crowd sprinkling holy water on mattresses, clothing, and even people themselves, creating what observers described as the largest outdoor benediction in church history and certainly the only papal blessing ceremony focused primarily on bedding and undergarments. The immediate results were predictably disappointing. Despite the enormous spiritual effort and expense involved in organizing the pilgrimage, flea populations showed no measurable response to having been collectively excommunicated by the highest religious authority in medieval Europe, leading to theological debates about whether the creatures were immune to divine intervention or whether the pilgrims had failed to achieve sufficient purity to merit miraculous pest relief. What happened next at the English court would strain credibility if it weren't documented in multiple independent sources that survived the medieval period, including the private diary of Archbishop Edmund of Abingdon and official household records that were apparently too embarrassing to destroy but too bizarre to publicize. King Henry III of England, driven to complete psychological breakdown by months of sleepless nights and constant flea attacks that left him covered in infected wounds and barely capable of rational thought, made what historians now recognize as one of the most undignified decisions ever recorded in the annals of European royalty. He abandoned his royal bed entirely and began sleeping on the stone floor of Westminster Palace like a penitent monk, claiming that fleas were less active on cold surfaces and that his royal dignity was worth sacrificing if it meant getting even a few hours of uninterrupted rest. The sight of the King of England, dressed in his night robes and surrounded by silk cushions arranged directly on freezing stone floors, was so shocking that several courtiers requested transfers to other royal households rather than witness their monarch's complete surrender to parasitic enemies that weighed less than feathers but had defeated the descendant of William the Conqueror. Henry's floor sleeping period lasted for an astonishing 4 months, during which he conducted royal business while lying on elaborate Persian carpets spread across stone surfaces, creating the surreal spectacle of foreign ambassadors being received by a monarch who insisted on remaining horizontal throughout diplomatic negotiations because sitting upright in chairs made him vulnerable to renewed flea attacks. The king's personal physician, Master Robert of Canterbury, attempted to maintain some semblance of medical dignity by declaring that floor sleeping was actually a revolutionary treatment for corrupted humors and overheated blood. But his explanations became increasingly desperate as weeks passed and it became obvious that the King of England was essentially camping inside his own palace like a homeless person who happened to wear a crown. The absolute nadir of royal dignity came during the infamous Christmas feast of 1253, when Henry had finally returned to sleeping in an elevated bed after his servants assured him that new fumigation treatments had eliminated the flea population from his chambers. The Great Hall of Westminster was filled with hundreds of England's most important nobles, church leaders, and foreign dignitaries who had gathered for what was supposed to be the most prestigious social event of the medieval calendar, featuring elaborate entertainment, exotic foods, and ceremonial displays of royal magnificence that would reinforce England's status among European powers. Everything proceeded normally through the first several courses, with musicians performing, wine flowing freely, and conversation focusing on the usual topics of politics, religion, and military campaigns that dominated medieval high society gatherings. Then, as Henry rose to deliver the traditional royal toast that would officially begin the evening's festivities, a massive wave of fleas emerged from the freshly installed tapestries like a biblical plague descending upon Egypt, except this plague was attacking the most powerful people in England while they were dressed in their finest clothes and trying to maintain sophisticated dinner conversation. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Grown men who commanded armies began slapping themselves frantically while trying to continue eating, noble ladies abandoned centuries of etiquette training and began scratching openly while attempting to maintain polite smiles, and foreign ambassadors watched in horror as the English court dissolved into what resembled a mass outbreak of demonic possession rather than a formal royal celebration. King Henry himself, standing at the head table with a golden goblet raised in toast, was visibly overwhelmed by flea attacks within minutes, his prepared speech forgotten as he began swatting at invisible enemies while hundreds of the most important people in medieval England scrambled under tables, fled the hall entirely, or stood paralyzed by the impossible choice between maintaining dignity and seeking relief from creatures that were literally driving them insane. The evening ended with the unprecedented sight of English royalty and their distinguished guests evacuating Westminster's Great Hall in complete chaos, leaving behind a feast that had cost more than most people earned in their lifetimes, while the fleas claimed victory over human civilization in what amounted to the most expensive pest control failure in recorded history. What medieval Europeans couldn't possibly understand as they battled their flea infestations with prayer, bloodletting, and expensive fumigation schemes was that they were actually conducting a continent-wide rehearsal for one of history's most devastating pandemics, creating the perfect conditions and behavioral patterns that would allow bubonic plague to sweep across Europe just a few decades later with unprecedented speed and lethality. The same fleas that were tormenting kings and nobles in castle bedchambers were part of a vast ecological network that connected medieval Europe to trading routes extending all the way to Central Asia, where a particularly deadly strain of Yersinia pestis bacteria was quietly evolving in rodent populations that thrived in the unsanitary conditions that characterized urban centers from London to Constantinople. The irony is breathtaking. While European nobility was spending fortunes trying to eliminate fleas from their personal living spaces, they were simultaneously creating the ideal infrastructure for a plague pandemic through their trading networks, military campaigns, and diplomatic missions that moved people, goods, and most importantly, flea-infested materials across vast distances without any understanding of how disease transmission actually worked. The flea crisis of the 1250s essentially served as a biological early warning system that medieval society was completely unprepared to interpret or act upon, as the same social and cultural factors that made flea control impossible, religious prohibitions against cleanliness, medical theories that ignored basic cause and effect, and political structures that prioritized appearance over practical solutions, would prove equally useless when confronted with an epidemic that killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. The connection became tragically direct when merchant ships returning from Black Sea trading posts in the 1340s carried not just the usual cargo of flea-infested textiles and grain supplies, but rats whose fleas harbored plague bacteria that had evolved to be transmitted efficiently between humans through the same biting insects that had been driving European royalty to madness for nearly a century. The medieval response to early plague outbreaks followed exactly the same pattern that had characterized their approach to the flea crisis. Religious authorities declared it divine punishment for moral failures, medical experts proposed treatments based on ancient theories that had no relationship to reality, and political leaders implemented expensive, elaborate solutions that addressed everything except the actual cause of the problem. Cities across Europe applied the same futile fumigation techniques that had failed in castle bedchambers, organized the same type of religious processions and mass prayers that had proved useless against fleas, and blamed the same categories of social outcasts and minorities for problems that were fundamentally rooted in ignorance about basic hygiene and disease prevention. The most disturbing parallel emerged when plague-stricken communities began exhibiting the same internal conflicts and scapegoating behaviors that had torn apart castle societies during the flea crisis, with neighbors turning against each other, authorities executing servants and subordinates for failing to prevent unpreventable disasters, and entire social structures collapsing under the weight of persistent physical suffering that no one understood how to address effectively. Perhaps most significantly, the decades of flea-related sleep deprivation and chronic stress had actually weakened European populations in ways that made them more susceptible to plague infection, as malnutrition, exhaustion, and compromised immune systems created ideal conditions for bacteria that thrived in hosts who were already struggling with parasitic infections and related health complications. The geographical spread of the Black Death followed trade routes and social networks that had been established partly through the medieval obsession with importing exotic pest control solutions, meaning that the same commercial relationships that brought sacred cats from Egypt and specialized fumigation materials from Constantinople also carried plague-infected fleas that transformed local health crises into continental catastrophe. By 1348, when plague reached its peak intensity across Europe, the same castles that had been abandoned during severe flea infestations became temporary refuges for survivors fleeing infected cities, creating a cruel historical symmetry where buildings that had once been considered uninhabitable due to parasites became desperately sought shelter from a pandemic that was spread by the same types of creatures that medieval society had spent decades failing to understand or control effectively. The absolute pinnacle of medieval anti-flea madness reached its crescendo in the spring of 1254 when a consortium of European nobles, led by the increasingly unhinged Eleanor of Provence and funded by desperate royalty across the continent, launched what they grandly termed the Great Fumigation, a coordinated attempt to simultaneously smoke out every major castle in Western Europe using a combination of military engineering, alchemical theory, and sheer financial recklessness that would make previous pest control efforts look like modest household projects. The plan, which had been developed over months of secret correspondence between courts that were too embarrassed to acknowledge their ongoing flea problems publicly, involved the construction of massive fumigation apparatus that resembled siege engines more than cleaning equipment, with enormous bellows systems, networks of sealed chambers, and delivery mechanisms for toxic smoke that required teams of engineers who had previously designed weapons for conquering cities rather than eliminating insects. Eleanor had convinced herself and her royal collaborators that the fundamental problem with earlier fumigation efforts was insufficient scale and intensity, arguing that fleas had developed resistance to small-scale treatments and could only be defeated through overwhelming chemical assault that would penetrate every possible hiding place within castle structures and create atmospheric conditions so hostile that no living creature smaller than a human could survive. The engineering challenges were staggering, requiring the modification of entire castle architectures to accommodate ceiling systems that could contain poisonous vapors while allowing human operators to escape before being killed by their own anti-flea weapons, essentially turning medieval fortresses into giant versions of the fumigation chambers that had already proved useless on smaller scales. The chemical components of the Great Fumigation represented the most expensive shopping list in medieval history, including rare sulfur compounds imported from Sicily, exotic plant materials from North Africa, metallic powders that required months of alchemical preparation, and aromatic substances from Asia that cost more per ounce than gold and were being deployed against creatures that weighed practically nothing and reproduced faster than medieval accountants could calculate expenses. Teams of specialists were recruited from across Europe to manage different aspects of the operation, including military engineers who designed the fumigation apparatus, alchemists who supervised the chemical preparations, physicians who theoretically understood the medical implications of massive smoke inhalation, and clergy who blessed the entire enterprise while praying that God would overlook the enormous waste of resources on what was essentially a war against insects. The day of the Great Fumigation created scenes across Europe that defied rational description, as thousands of nobles, servants, clergy, and livestock were evacuated from major castles while teams of masked operators activated fumigation systems that filled entire buildings with dense, toxic clouds that were visible for miles and created atmospheric disturbances that local peasants interpreted as either divine miracles or demonic invasions. King Louis IX of France, Queen Eleanor of England, and their counterparts across the continent spent 3 weeks camped in elaborate tent cities outside their own castles like wealthy refugees from their own pest control efforts, maintaining royal courts in temporary structures while their permanent residences were being systematically poisoned in the hope that fleas would prove less resilient than the human occupants who were paying for this massive experiment in environmental warfare. The results were immediate, dramatic, and ultimately disappointing. The fumigation process successfully killed enormous quantities of fleas along with every other form of life that couldn't evacuate in time, including birds, mice, insects, plants, and several fumigation operators who miscalculated their escape timing. But within days of reoccupation, new flea populations began appearing through the same entry points and breeding grounds that had never been addressed by any of the elaborate solutions that medieval ingenuity had devised. The financial cost of the Great Fumigation exceeded the combined annual tax revenues of several kingdoms, forcing participating rulers to impose emergency levies, borrow from foreign bankers at ruinous interest rates, and sell royal properties to cover expenses that had achieved nothing except creating the most expensive pest control failure in recorded history while demonstrating once again that medieval society's approach to problem-solving involved applying massive resources to symptoms, while completely ignoring root causes that could have been addressed with soap, hot water, and basic understanding of cleanliness principles that wouldn't be discovered for several more centuries. While European nobility bankrupted themselves pursuing increasingly absurd solutions to their flea problems, the peasant populations who witnessed these spectacles from the outside developed what can only be described as a collective sense of bemused contempt for their supposedly superior rulers who apparently couldn't solve problems that common people had been managing through practical methods for generations. Village blacksmiths, farmers, and craftsmen watched in amazement as royal processions carried expensive fumigation equipment past their homes, heading toward castles where the most powerful people in Europe were preparing to wage chemical warfare against creatures that peasants controlled through simple techniques like regularly washing their bedding, changing straw frequently, and maintaining basic cleanliness standards that didn't require theological justification or medical consultation. The irony wasn't lost on people who lived in one-room cottages that were often more comfortable and flea-free than the royal palaces where kings spent fortunes on solutions that consistently failed to address obvious causes, leading to underground jokes and folk songs that mocked noble intelligence while celebrating common-sense approaches to household management that didn't require university degrees or divine intervention. Market gossip during this period was dominated by increasingly elaborate stories about royal flea-fighting failures, with merchants and traders sharing second-hand accounts of kings sleeping on floors, queens burning entire castle furnishings, and nobles fleeing their own homes like they were under siege by invisible armies, creating a parallel narrative that portrayed medieval Europe's ruling class as helpless children who couldn't manage basic aspects of daily life without creating expensive disasters. The peasant reaction was particularly harsh because common people understood intuitively that the fundamental problem was cultural rather than technological. They watched nobles proudly bragging about how rarely they bathed, saw aristocrats treating dirty clothing as status symbols, and witnessed the upper classes treating basic hygiene as sinful behavior, making it obvious that flea infestations were natural consequences of lifestyle choices rather than mysterious curses that required supernatural solutions. Village women who regularly washed clothes, cleaned homes, and maintained sanitary living conditions couldn't comprehend how educated, wealthy people could spend years failing to make connections that seemed self-evident to anyone with practical experience managing households on limited budgets where waste and inefficiency meant genuine hardship rather than amusing anecdotes for court entertainment. The most scathing peasant commentary focused on the religious aspects of noble flea-fighting efforts, as rural priests and their congregations developed their own theological interpretations that portrayed the ongoing crisis as divine punishment for pride, vanity, and the sin of believing that wealth and social status could substitute for basic wisdom and humility before God's natural laws. Folk preachers began incorporating flea metaphors into sermons about the dangers of worldly pride, using recent royal failures as cautionary tales that demonstrated how the mighty could be brought low by the smallest of God's creatures when they refused to acknowledge their own ignorance and adopt practical solutions that were available to anyone humble enough to learn from experience rather than ancient books. The emergence of flea proverbs during this period reflects the peasant community's collective judgment about noble competence, with sayings like, "A king who can't sleep has lost his crown to creatures with no kingdom," and "Gold cannot buy what soap provides for free," becoming common expressions that encoded sharp criticism of aristocratic pretensions while celebrating practical knowledge that didn't require formal education or expensive consultants. Perhaps most significantly, the flea crisis created new forms of social commentary that allowed common people to openly mock their social superiors without directly challenging political authority, since everyone could agree that fleas were enemies worthy of ridicule and defeat, making it safe to laugh at noble failures while implying broader criticisms about competence and intelligence that would have been dangerous to express directly. The long-term cultural impact was profound, as the spectacle of European royalty being defeated by tiny insects while spending enormous sums on useless solutions contributed to growing skepticism about aristocratic claims to natural superiority and divine right to rule, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into more direct challenges to medieval social hierarchy when future generations had less reason to fear immediate consequences of questioning whether noble birth actually correlated with practical wisdom or effective leadership abilities. The flea crisis of the 1250s left an indelible mark on European civilization that extended far beyond the immediate suffering of sleep-deprived royalty, fundamentally altering architectural practices, court protocols, and social attitudes in ways that would influence medieval culture for centuries while creating some of the most bizarre legal documents and construction specifications ever recorded in the annals of European history. The most visible legacy appeared in what architectural historians now call post-flea castle design, a revolutionary approach to fortress construction that prioritized pest prevention over traditional defensive considerations, resulting in buildings that looked like military installations but functioned more like primitive laboratories designed to minimize parasite breeding opportunities. Castle builders across Europe began incorporating features that would have seemed insane to earlier generations, including raised sleeping platforms that kept beds several feet above floor level, specialized ventilation systems that created air currents designed to discourage insect habitation, and storage chambers with smooth stone surfaces that eliminated the cracks and crevices where fleas traditionally established their colonies. The architectural specifications for these new designs read like fantasy novels, with detailed requirements for flea-resistant masonry, parasite-proof jointery, and insect-deterrent surface treatments that required craftsmen to learn entirely new construction techniques and use materials that had never previously been considered essential for building projects. Perhaps most bizarrely, several royal architects developed what they called sacrificial chambers, rooms specifically designed to attract and concentrate flea populations so they could be isolated and destroyed without affecting the rest of the castle, essentially creating medieval pest ghettos that served as early versions of integrated pest management systems, though the underlying theories about insect behavior were completely wrong. The legal legacy proved equally strange as European courts began producing what amounted to the world's first sanitation codes, though these documents were disguised as royal proclamations about moral behavior and spiritual purification rather than practical health regulations. King Edward I of England issued the famous Statute of Clean Beds in 1272, which established legal requirements for changing straw bedding, washing linens, and maintaining Christian cleanliness standards that were actually thinly disguised pest control measures presented as religious obligations to avoid admitting that previous royal policies had been fundamentally wrong. Similar legislation appeared across the continent, creating a patchwork of hygiene laws that were technically enforceable but practically impossible to implement given the cultural resistance to cleanliness that had created the original problems, leading to legal systems where people could theoretically be punished for behaviors that were still considered spiritually virtuous by large segments of medieval society. The most lasting cultural impact emerged in the form of court etiquette modifications that transformed flea-related behaviors into acceptable social rituals, essentially normalizing scratching and pest-related discomfort by incorporating them into formal protocols that made suffering appear dignified rather than embarrassing. Medieval courtesy manuals from the late 13th century include detailed instructions for discreet scratching techniques that allowed nobles to address flea bites without appearing undignified, appropriate responses to pest-related interruptions during formal ceremonies, and proper methods for discussing parasite problems that maintained social hierarchy while acknowledging universal suffering. These etiquette innovations created bizarre social situations where European nobility developed sophisticated sign language systems for communicating about flea problems during formal events, learned special breathing techniques for enduring insect attacks without visible reaction, and practiced facial expressions that conveyed authority and competence while being eaten alive by creatures they couldn't see or effectively combat. The scientific legacy was perhaps most ironic, as the massive resources devoted to flea research during the crisis period produced mountains of documentation about medieval pest control efforts that provided future generations with detailed records of expensive failure, creating an inadvertent historical archive that demonstrated exactly how not to approach practical problems while revealing the extent to which cultural blindness could prevent intelligent people from recognizing obvious solutions. Medieval universities began offering specialized courses in parasitic philosophy and theological entomology that attempted to integrate flea-fighting failures into broader intellectual frameworks, producing academic treatises that are simultaneously fascinating as historical documents and completely useless as practical guides, representing some of the most expensive educational content ever created about subjects that could have been resolved through basic common sense and soap. If we could somehow transport King Louis IX or Eleanor of Provence forward in time to experience a modern five-star hotel, their reactions would probably range from complete psychological breakdown to religious conversion, as they encountered standards of cleanliness that would seem like supernatural magic to people who spent their entire lives being tortured by problems that we now solve automatically without conscious thought. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval king that modern people consider it normal to sleep in beds that are completely free of parasites, that we change our sheets weekly or even daily, and that we would consider a hotel unacceptable if we found even a single flea anywhere on the premises. They would probably assume you were describing some impossible paradise that could only exist in the afterlife rather than standard accommodations available to middle-class travelers who complain if the Wi-Fi is slow or the bathroom fixtures aren't sufficiently modern. The medieval mind would be completely unable to process the idea that ordinary people in the 21st century possess greater control over their sleeping environment than the most powerful monarchs in European history, that we routinely achieve levels of cleanliness that medieval royalty couldn't have imagined even in their most optimistic fantasies about what unlimited wealth and absolute power might theoretically accomplish. Try explaining to Eleanor of Provence, who spent a fortune burning entire castle furnishings to eliminate flea populations, that modern pest control involves calling a service that charges less than she spent on a single tapestry and can guarantee complete elimination of any insect problem within days using chemicals that are safe enough to apply while people continue living in their homes. The concept that we consider pest infestations to be unusual problems requiring immediate professional attention rather than normal aspects of daily life would probably seem as fantastical to medieval people as casual time travel or instant communication across continents, representing achievements that transcend their understanding of what human civilization could theoretically accomplish. Medieval kings who bankrupted their treasuries trying to sleep peacefully would be absolutely stunned to discover that modern hotel guests complain about minor inconveniences like insufficient towel fluffiness, room temperature variations of a few degrees, or breakfast selections that don't meet their personal preferences, Problems that would have seemed like impossible luxury to people who considered a single night without being attacked by parasites to be a miraculous blessing worthy of religious thanksgiving. The medieval reaction to modern bathroom facilities alone would probably require medical intervention, as people who believed that bathing was spiritually dangerous encountered environments where multiple hot showers per day are considered normal and entire rooms are dedicated exclusively to washing activities that they associated with moral corruption and physical danger. King Henry III, who spent months sleeping on stone floors to escape flea attacks, would probably suffer complete mental collapse when confronted with heated floors, climate-controlled environments, and mattresses that are designed for maximum comfort rather than minimum parasite habitation, luxuries that exceed anything he could have conceived even in his most ambitious architectural fantasies. The irony reaches peak absurdity when you consider that medieval Europeans were actually much closer to solving their flea problems than they realized. They had access to soap, hot water, and basic cleaning materials that could have eliminated their parasite issues completely, but their cultural beliefs prevented them from using solutions that were literally within arm's reach while they spent fortunes on elaborate alternatives that had no chance of working. Modern people accidentally maintain flea-free environments through daily habits that we perform unconsciously, washing our bodies regularly, cleaning our clothes frequently, maintaining sanitary living spaces, and replacing bedding materials before they become breeding grounds for parasites, activities that medieval nobility would have considered either impossible, dangerous, or morally offensive depending on their particular theological and medical beliefs. Perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of this comparison is realizing that we've solved medieval Europe's greatest luxury problems so completely that modern children grow up without ever experiencing the constant physical torment that defined daily life for the most privileged people in 13th century civilization, meaning that contemporary elementary school students enjoy superior sleeping conditions to those available to kings who commanded armies and shaped the political destiny of entire continents. The medieval flea crisis represents one of history's most spectacular examples of how cultural assumptions can create suffering that persists for generations despite the availability of simple solutions, a lesson that remains relevant whenever we encounter modern problems that might be perpetuated by our own unexamined beliefs about what's possible, necessary, or appropriate in addressing challenges that seem insurmountable but could actually be resolved through approaches that we haven't considered because they contradict conventional wisdom or established practices. So what can we learn from this absolutely ridiculous chapter in European history, where the most powerful people on Earth were systematically defeated by creatures so small they were practically invisible, yet so effective at psychological warfare that they could reduce kings to scratching, sleepless madness while bankrupting entire kingdoms through spectacularly ineffective countermeasures? The fundamental lesson is both hilarious and deeply unsettling. Unlimited wealth, absolute political authority, and access to the best education available in medieval civilization meant absolutely nothing when confronted with problems that required practical solutions rather than elaborate theories, expensive materials, or divine intervention through prayer and ritual sacrifice. Medieval Europe's flea crisis represents perhaps the most expensive example in recorded history of intelligent people choosing to ignore obvious solutions because those solutions contradicted their cultural beliefs about how the world should work, creating a situation where common sense was literally considered sinful while systematic suffering was transformed into evidence of spiritual virtue and intellectual sophistication. The medieval nobility spent decades proving that you can have all the gold in Europe, command armies that stretch to the horizon, and employ the most learned scholars of your age, yet still be completely helpless against problems that any modern child could solve with basic hygiene practices that we teach in elementary school and consider so fundamental that we rarely think about them consciously. This wasn't a case of medieval people being stupid or lacking the necessary resources to address their flea problems. They had soap, they had hot water, they had cleaning materials, and they certainly had enough servants to maintain sanitary living conditions if they had chosen to prioritize cleanliness over their bizarre cultural obsession with avoiding activities that they associated with vanity, spiritual corruption, and moral weakness. Instead, they chose to spend enormous resources on increasingly elaborate solutions that addressed everything except the actual cause of their suffering, creating what amounts to a centuries-long case study in how cultural blindness can perpetuate problems that have simple solutions hiding in plain sight. The moral of this story extends far beyond medieval pest control failures, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ideological commitments override practical evidence, especially when the people making decisions are insulated from the worst consequences of their choices by wealth, status, and social structures that allow them to externalize the costs of their mistakes onto subordinates who have no power to implement better alternatives. Medieval kings could afford to be wrong about flea control because they could always blame servants, execute scapegoats, and hire new experts with different theories, creating systems where persistent failure never forced the kind of honest self-evaluation that might have led to questioning fundamental assumptions about cleanliness, medicine, and the relationship between cultural practices and physical consequences. The truly disturbing aspect of the medieval flea crisis is how closely it resembles modern situations where obvious solutions to persistent problems are ignored or actively rejected because they don't align with established beliefs, professional interests, or social expectations that prioritize appearing correct over actually solving problems effectively. We like to imagine that we're much smarter than medieval people who couldn't figure out how to avoid being tortured by fleas, but our modern world is full of examples where expensive, complicated solutions are preferred over simple, affordable approaches that don't generate profits for experts, don't require specialized knowledge that justifies professional authority, and don't create opportunities for people to demonstrate their sophistication through elaborate theoretical frameworks that have minimal connection to practical results. The medieval flea wars remind us that human beings are remarkably consistent across centuries in our ability to overcomplicate problems, ignore obvious solutions, and convince ourselves that suffering is inevitable when it's actually completely preventable through approaches that we reject for reasons that have nothing to do with effectiveness and everything to do with protecting our assumptions about how intelligent, sophisticated people should approach challenges that threaten their comfort, authority, and worldview. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from this bizarre historical episode is the importance of periodically asking ourselves whether we're solving problems or just creating more expensive ways to avoid confronting the simple changes that would eliminate them entirely, especially when those changes might require admitting that our previous approaches were fundamentally wrong and that practical solutions don't always require the kind of expertise, resources, and cultural sophistication that we prefer to associate with serious problem-solving efforts. If you think the medieval flea crisis represents the pinnacle of royal stupidity and expensive problem-solving failures, prepare yourself for stories that will make Louis IX's scratching competitions and Eleanor's furniture-burning marathons look like models of rational decision-making and fiscal responsibility. The medieval world was absolutely packed with luxury problems that demonstrate how the combination of unlimited resources, complete ignorance, and cultural blind spots could create suffering so bizarre and avoidable that modern people would assume these stories were satirical fiction rather than documented historical facts about how European royalty actually lived, suffered, and died while surrounded by wealth that could have solved their problems instantly if applied with even minimal common sense. Next time, we're diving into the absolutely insane world of medieval royal bathing rituals, where European monarchs who were terrified of water developed increasingly elaborate alternatives that were somehow supposed to achieve cleanliness without involving the dangerous, spiritually corrupting act of actually washing their bodies with soap and hot water. You'll discover how King John of England employed teams of servants to scrape accumulated grime off his skin using specialized tools that resembled torture devices, how French queens paid enormous sums for dry cleaning treatments that involved being rubbed down with expensive fabrics and aromatic powders that left them dirtier than before, and why the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II spent a fortune constructing what amounted to a medieval car wash for humans that used everything except actual water to remove months of accumulated filth from royal bodies. We'll explore the tragic story of Queen Isabella of France, who became so terrified of water that she hired professional cleaners to maintain her appearance using techniques that involved hot irons, abrasive materials, and chemical treatments so dangerous that several servants died from exposure to the toxic substances that were supposed to make the queen more attractive and socially acceptable. The medical theories behind medieval waterless hygiene were even more ridiculous than their flea-fighting strategies, involving complex explanations about how different types of dirt had different spiritual and physical properties that required specialized removal techniques, leading to the development of an entire industry dedicated to providing alternatives to basic washing that were exponentially more expensive, time-consuming, and ineffective than the simple methods they were designed to replace. But the royal bathing crisis pales in comparison to what we'll discover when we examine medieval approaches to dental care, where European nobility developed such elaborate methods for avoiding toothbrushing that they created an entire economy around alternatives that were somehow supposed to maintain oral health without the spiritually dangerous practice of regular cleaning. You'll learn about gold tooth covers that were designed to hide decay rather than prevent it, expensive mouthwashing rituals that involved exotic substances imported from distant continents, and the absolutely horrifying practice of tooth replacement using materials that would make modern dentists flee in terror while questioning the sanity of anyone who would voluntarily undergo such procedures. We'll also explore the medieval obsession with perfume as a substitute for cleanliness, where European royalty spent more on aromatic substances than most kingdoms collected in annual taxes, creating an industry dedicated to masking human odors that had reached levels so extreme they could allegedly be detected from miles away by people with sensitive noses. The competition between different courts to develop the most effective smell-masking strategies led to diplomatic incidents, international trade disputes, and technological innovations that were simultaneously impressive from an engineering perspective and completely pointless from a practical health standpoint. And if you think those stories are unbelievable, wait until we examine the medieval approach to food preservation and royal dining, where European nobility regularly consumed meals that were literally rotting while they ate them, convinced that expensive spices and elaborate preparation methods could somehow transform spoiled ingredients into safe, nutritious food that wouldn't kill them or their dinner guests. These aren't isolated incidents of individual stupidity, they represent systematic cultural patterns that affected entire civilizations for centuries, creating suffering and waste on scales that are difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective, where basic hygiene, dental care, and food safety are so routine that we rarely think about how revolutionary these concepts would have seemed to people who spent enormous resources avoiding practices that we consider fundamental to human health and social acceptability. As you drift back to your own comfortable, flea-free bed tonight, take a moment to appreciate the absolute miracle of modern life that allows you to sleep peacefully without being attacked by tiny vampires who ruled the nights of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers and transformed royal palaces into battlegrounds where human dignity went to die in the most expensive and ridiculous ways imaginable. The story of medieval Europe's flea wars isn't just a bizarre historical curiosity, it's a perfect demonstration of how cultural assumptions can create persistent suffering that continues for generations despite the availability of simple solutions, and how wealth, education, and social status mean absolutely nothing when confronted with problems that require practical thinking rather than elaborate theories, expensive consultants, and supernatural interventions that ignore obvious cause and effect relationships. King Louis IX, Eleanor of Provence, and their fellow royal flea fighters spent decades proving that you can have unlimited resources and still be completely helpless against challenges that modern elementary school students could solve with basic knowledge about cleanliness, hygiene, and common-sense approaches to household management that we take for granted every single day. Their spectacular failures remind us that progress isn't inevitable and that human beings are remarkably consistent across centuries in our ability to overcomplicate problems, ignore practical solutions, and convince ourselves that suffering is unavoidable when it's actually completely preventable through approaches that we reject for reasons that have more to do with protecting our worldview than achieving effective results. The medieval flea crisis represents one of history's most expensive lessons about the dangers of letting ideological commitments override empirical evidence, especially when the people making decisions are insulated from the consequences of their mistakes by social structures that allow them to blame subordinates, hire new experts, and continue failing without ever confronting the possibility that their fundamental assumptions might be wrong. But here's what makes this story ultimately hopeful rather than depressing. Medieval Europe eventually figured out that cleanliness wasn't spiritually dangerous, that regular washing prevented pest infestations, and that practical solutions were more effective than theoretical frameworks, proving that even deeply entrenched cultural blindness can be overcome when reality becomes too uncomfortable to ignore and when enough people finally decide that results matter more than maintaining appearances or protecting established authority. The transition from medieval flea torture to modern pest-free living didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't accomplished by kings or nobles who had spent centuries demonstrating their incompetence. It was achieved by ordinary people who were willing to experiment with approaches that violated conventional wisdom but actually worked in practice, creating gradual cultural changes that eventually made medieval hygiene practices seem as absurd to later generations as they seem to us today. This transformation gives us hope that our own cultural blind spots and systemic failures aren't permanent features of human civilization, but temporary obstacles that can be overcome when we're willing to prioritize practical results over theoretical elegance, evidence over authority, and effective solutions over approaches that just make us feel sophisticated and important while perpetuating problems that could be solved immediately if we were brave enough to abandon methods that don't work, in favor of alternatives that do. So before you fall asleep tonight in your clean, comfortable, parasite-free bedroom, consider subscribing to this channel if you enjoyed this journey through medieval Europe's most embarrassing crisis, and let us know in the comments what other historical disasters you'd like to see explored. We have plenty more stories about expensive failures, cultural blindness, and the eternal human struggle between practical solutions and elaborate nonsense that makes us feel better about ourselves while accomplishing absolutely nothing useful. sweet dreams, and remember that every time you change your sheets, take a shower, or sleep peacefully through the night, you're enjoying luxuries that medieval royalty would have considered impossible, miracles worthy of religious worship and international diplomacy, which should make you feel pretty good about being alive in an era when basic human problems have been solved so completely that we rarely think about how revolutionary these solutions would have seemed to people who spent their entire lives being tortured by challenges that we've forgotten even exist. Until next time, keep questioning conventional wisdom, stay curious about the absurd ways our ancestors approached problems that seem obvious to us now, and never underestimate the power of simple solutions to eliminate suffering that seems inevitable until someone finally tries the approaches that everyone else has been avoiding for reasons that make perfect sense until they're examined closely and revealed to be completely ridiculous.